Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar of an updated digital forensics series, part of a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Cowd and I'll MC. Your mentor is the talented raconteur, Matt Constable. Wherever and whenever you're watching along, we hope you are safe and well and comfortable, and thanks again for joining us. Before we begin, the usual housekeeping. We quite clearly still use Zoom for our webinars and encourage questions and the use of chat throughout the webinar. We ask that you direct all questions relevant to course content to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions about dates, times, resource availability, and the like to the support team in chat. Can I ask that if you have any questions about your password for the course page, the issue is still not resolved. We've escalated it, and in the tail end of this week, we're hoping to just sort of reset everyone who needs its password. So if you're having issues, send us an email. We'll add you to the list. Hopefully, sort it out quick, smart. But yeah, don't worry if it seems to be an issue. We're aware of it, and we'll get to it. So don't populate the chat with that. Chat it with, fill it with wonderful augmentee comments. Tell us about your experience of what Matt's talking about. You can chat with panelists only or to everyone else, and you can make that choice once you open up the chat log. We'll have Q&A sessions at the end of the webinar. Or if a question is particularly relevant to what Matt's talking about at the time, I'll just interrupt. Also, this webinar may run a bit longer if there's lots of good questions, but this time it'll all be killer content from Matt. So we're hoping to get a good lot of questions in, chuck them in, and we'll try and get to them all. Hannah, as usual, is around in administrative and technical support role for IT Masters. She's responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, or the course page, or the Moodle, whatever you want to call it. Not for the tech side of it, so these passwords things got naught to do with her, but that's where you'll find all the other materials needed for the course, links to readings and Matt's hands-on tasks and discussion forums and the quizzes as well. If you have any questions tonight or later on, you can always use the contact details on that page. It's time to welcome Matt. Hello, Matt. How are you? What tales of the week? Contractual obligations out of the way. Talk, Matt.
Aha, thank you very much. I wasn't going to say a word until you said talk, Matt. So thank you for that, Guy. Thank you for your splendiferous introduction as per normal. So welcome, everyone. I hope everyone's well and able to join us. Our numbers are down a little bit, but that's probably unsurprising given that we're on a different night this evening. So hopefully everyone will catch up with the YouTube at some stage between now and next week. So I had a nice little break and ready to get back into it as usual with this very interesting and captivating subject of digital forensics. So third week, module 3, what are we looking at tonight? So we're looking at digital forensic context. So what does that actually mean? So we're going to look at some of the, I guess, a little more left of center environments in which you might consider or might have to do some digital investigations on. In these sort of subjects at most universities, and even a little bit with our 597 subject, we tend to focus on the traditional things like the file systems and hard drives and those lower hanging fruit, if you want to put it that way. And I will talk a little bit about file systems here this evening, just to include it inside the topic, to give you a broad overview of sort of what we teach in 597, or what ARIF teaches in 597. But then on top of that, we'll look at a little bit around network forensics, and only a little bit, just to give you a bit of a teaser. And then we'll have a look at some social networking ideas and email and around mobile devices. So a little bit of a different sort of context, if you like. Just as an aside, in the other subject, the other digital forensic subject in our umbrella, 513 forensic investigations, in that we sort of talk more about those left of center subjects as well. So that's just a little, so we talk about ransomware, malware, and those sort of things as well in that. So without further ado anyway, let's get into this content because there is 44 slides to get through, and then I want to allow plenty of time for Q&A. So we're going to look at OS and file systems, we're going to look at virtual platforms, and we're going to look at email and social media with a little bit of mobile devices built in there as well. So file systems, we're going to talk about a little bit around the purpose and the structure of operating system file systems, so what they're used for, basically a filing cabinet. We'll see that in a second. And then we're going to look at a little bit around clusters and disk partitioning, and then have a little bit of a discussion around the two, I guess, traditional file systems in that Windows environment of FAT and NTFS. So what do we need a file system for a start? So a file system is really just a system of organizing and storing your files, whatever they may be, whatever content they hold, in a logical structure so that you can find them when you need them. And from a security perspective, also so that you can secure them based on their location or user rights. If you don't have a structured file system, then that makes it a little bit more difficult to do. The type of the file system that an operating system will use will determine how the data is stored on the storage device of choice. So whether that's a solid state drive, a traditional electronic / mechanical magnetic one, or whether it's some other remote file storage system like in the cloud or a storage array network. It's important as a forensic investigator that you understand how the data is stored and organized in the different operating systems that you're going to come across. So you need to understand how it's done in a Windows sense, a Linux or Unix sense, a Mac OS sense, mobile device. Okay, so they all, the nuts and bolts of a file system, the principles are still the same, but the way in which things are organized and accessed may be different. So it's important that you have a good understanding of that. And that's going to determine what sort of devices you have the capability to investigate using. It's important that you're familiar with both the underlying operating system and the file system structure that it uses to store files, regardless of what device you're looking at. As a digital forensic investigator, you may be interested in some of the following attributes which can be assigned to files or are assigned to files. So you might be interested in when a file was created, when it was modified, or when it was deleted, and the associated detail around that. In other words, the time and date that that happened and potentially who did it. You might be interested if files suddenly grow. So if they suddenly become really bloated. So if, for example, or if they're an unusual file size. So say, for example, you've got a notepad file. So just a text file that you might keep some passwords or something in, and it suddenly becomes 8 GB in size. You would have to have a lot of text in a notepad file for it to be 8 GB in size, so that would be unusual. Alternatively, you might have a Word document that you know is a couple of 100K, might just be, who knows, a bit of documentation that you've got for your network system. All of a sudden it becomes really fat and bloated as well. Okay, what's going on there? Is there something hidden in that? Is there something else that's happened? Has it been changed? So that can be a indication that something's going wrong or something's happening. File replacement, same sort of thing. A file is replaced, a new version is updated. So that's a modification. The archive bit, has a file been archived, or is it still active in a file system, as it were? Are they hidden? Are they read-only? Are they compressed? So all of those attributes may or may not be important for you to know each of those, or understand each of those attributes with reference to specific files when you're doing your investigation. Let's look at, for a start, where we store our files. Okay, so we're talking about, in most cases, I mean, the most complex of the devices is really that hard disk drive. If it's on a network device, a network storage system miles away, we generally can't see a lot of this detailed information. This is physical information that we need to be physically accessing the device in question to be able to see. And in things like solid state devices, so basically just glorified USB keys, then we don't have this same level of complexity. But the hard drive, the hard disk physical structure is quite important to have a basic understanding of. Obviously, if you're technically, if you're in a technical sort of job or have a technical understanding of these, then that's certainly going to be an advantage as a forensic investigator. So we're saying that the most commonly used storage devices, particularly for large scale storage, are hard disk drives. Okay, yes, you can get large scale solid state drives, aka USB drives now, basically, but still really big ones, high speed ones are often these sorts of devices. And they're made up of one or more plates or platters that are coated with a magnetic material that will allow the storage of digital data as either ones or zeros based on the use of a magnetic head. So if I just turn on my little laser pointer here, this read that, I'm not sure whether you can read that, but that writing there says read write head, and that read write head goes in and out as the platters spin around very, very fast, sometimes up to 10, 12,000 or more revs per minute. And that this little motor here called the actuator moves the actuator arm and the read write head backwards and forwards across this platter, and magnetic pulses are sent through that, which will then, or electrical pulses sent through it, which will then enable the writing of zeros or ones onto the hard disk surface itself. It's divided the disk drive platters. So each of the platters, or disks if you like, so they're bi-layer, you can use either side of them, and they're divided into a number of different geometric components if you like. So the geometry really just refers to how the disk is structured logically in terms of platters, tracks, and sectors. So a platter is simply a single layer. So you can, I'm not sure whether you can see in this diagram, it's a little bit small, unfortunately, but there are a number of platters, as indicated by that label there, multiple platters in that hard drive, and they're basically on this spindle, this center spindle, and they form a stack of disks, if you like, metal disks. And so the geometry just simply refers to that, plus the other logical components of it. So the head, that's this little device here under my red pointer now, and that reads and writes data to the drive as a whole or each of the magnetic platters. There's one of those heads on on either side of each of the platters. So there's a top side and a bottom side, underside. So there is a number of read-write heads in between each of these platters, which obviously with that diagram you can't actually see. The tracks, or what are called tracks, are simply the concentric circles on a disk platter where the data is located. So each of the circles around a disk is called a track. A cylinder is simply a column of tracks on two or more disk platters. So if we think of, we've got our disks here, there might be say 7 or 8, typically not that many, but let's say there's 7 or 8 in a stack. Then the track number 1 on all of those platters in the stack, if you look at it, if you look down the column, look down the stack, those track ones will all line up with each other and they form what's called the cylinder. And then a sector is simply a section of the track, so a subset of the track, and it's usually made up of 512 bytes of information in a typical sized hard drive, but that can vary based on the operating system and the size of the hard drive itself. In solid state storage devices, or SSDs, so again, as I said to you before, these are basically your USB keys or other type memory cards, often used in USB devices, laptops, tablets, or mobile phones, or cell phones, depending on where you are in the world, what you want to call them. In terms of laptops, they can be quite large. So if we look at this, this example of one over here, this is actually a slightly larger one, but you can, the newer ones actually look like, they just look like a hard drive. Or they can look like a memory stick, literally like a stick of flash memory or RAM that you put in your laptop, and it's got a slightly different connector, and you plug it into your motherboard, and there you go, you've got your solid state drive. Now these can represent some challenges to forensic examiners, because if deleted data is not recovered immediately, it can be permanently lost. And the reason that is because once you delete a file, and this is true in most operating systems in most standard configurations. So it can be changed, but it is typical that when you delete a file, it's not really deleted. It's just marked as deleted and put into a recycle bin type area, if you like. It's not actually physically moved on the disk. It's just marked as being available to delete. Now, if you were to undelete the file at that stage, then you would get the file back complete and there's no problem recovering it. If, however, you wait for a few weeks and that area of the disk drive is then is overwritten by some other file that's come along, then you've lost access to that original file. Because of the way that hard drives will fill up sectors, they'll write sector by sector. It is possible that you may actually have shadow fragments of files sitting in unused sectors, but you won't have access to the full file. Okay, and I think we have a look at this a little bit more next week when we look at forensic tools. When we deal with our solid state devices, it's therefore important to make that full forensic hashed copy as soon as we possibly can. For mobile device forensics, this is even more important because they are generally smaller capacity. Therefore, when files are deleted or replaced, they are generally replaced, turned over very, very quickly because of the small capacity size. Microsoft file structure. So this is the most commonly used operating system and file system. So the one you're probably most likely to run into. It's important to understand that concept of clusters and the two main variants of the file systems used, which of course are FAT and NTFS, which we'll look at in a minute. The file system used will determine where hidden data can reside. And this is really important, therefore, to understand what operating system you're using and how it hides data or deletes data. That's obviously going to reflect on your forensic investigation or your ability to find files. It's important to know where these areas are so that you can explore them to determine whether they actually there are any files there or file fragments that might give you some insight into what happened with a particular crime or incident. So in terms of sectors and clusters, as we were talking about before, so a sector is the smallest physical data storage unit on a disk. So that's just part of a particular track, of a single track. Okay, so each track is broken into, as an example, 512 bytes. So the size of a cluster, 512 bytes or more, is always an exponent of 2. So we're using binary arithmetic. So 512 bytes is 2 to the 9, 1024 is 2 to the 10, and so on and so forth. It's important to know what cluster or sector size your operating system uses. Because as I said before, there is the opportunity for file fragments or files to be hidden in part of a cluster or sector. And this is because, let's say that the cluster size is 512 bytes and you've got a 768 byte file. So the first 512 bytes will be written into the first cluster. So that cluster is fully taken up. 512 bytes, whatever was there before is now gone. The next 256 bytes are then written at the start of the next 512 byte cluster. That means in that cluster, you've got 256 bytes, which is overwritten, so has the new file on it. The remaining 256 bytes in that cluster, however, has not been written over with the new file and may contain fragments of an old file. So it is possible that that can happen, that definitely can happen. So the larger the cluster size, the more likelihood it is, well, in certain circumstances, depending on the average size of the file that you're writing. But in general, if you're looking at a typical average file size, then the larger the cluster size you have, the more likelihood there's going to be some spare slack space and therefore the opportunity to find file fragments. Sector ID data is written to the cluster or area immediately before the contents of the sector begins. And this simply identifies the starting address of that sector on the hard drive itself. So it gives you the physical location. In the Microsoft file systems, a cluster is simply a group of sectors. So multiple sectors together form a cluster. That's all it is. It consists, but they have to be consecutive or contiguous. So they've got to be one after the other. You can't pick a sector from track 1 and a sector from track 23 and put them together as a cluster. It doesn't work that way. They've got to be contiguous. The number of sectors is always an exponent of 2. So again, we're using binary arithmetic. And clusters are numbered sequentially, starting at 0 in NTFS and 2 in FAT, just to make it difficult. So again, important to know that the numbering is different for a start. In addition, many hard disks are logically divided into 2 or more sections. Okay, so say a C drive and a D drive, for example. So each of those sections is called a partition. So the Windows operating system will allow you to have 3 primary partitions, followed by an extended partition that can contain 1 or more logical drives. So your primary partition is generally 1 drive each. Extended partition can have multiple drives if you want to, as logical drives. There are also times where you will have hidden partitions or voids, which will use unused gaps between the partitions on a disk. And these are often used for restore purposes or low-level operating system purposes. There's a thing called a partition table, and this is where this is held within what's called the master boot record. So the master boot record gives you all the information around the disk and how to start it up basically from that lowest level you can think of. So the partition table holds information about the disk partitions, where each of them starts and ends, and it will enable, so it supports up to 4 primary partitions, even though Windows only supports 3 itself. In Win Hex, so a tool we're going to have a quick look at in a minute, you can see these partitions looking at the different hex offsets. So first partition will start at hex offset 1BE, second one 1CE, so on and so forth. So if we look at the slide here, this is I apologize for this is a really poor graphic, it's quite small, but you'll be able to see it when you open up the presentation yourself. We've just got a load of information here. We've got the partition file, the system codes for each of the partition files. We've got the first sector. So this area here denotes the first sector for each partition. We've got this area here denotes the number of sectors in each partition. I apologize, the writing is small, so that's why I'm reading out for you. And then these arrows are pointing to the partition offsets themselves. So you can see Win Hex, you can actually dump the contents of the hard drive, look at it in Hex, and actually see where these partitions and sectors and clusters and the different information actually resides on that disk. So a very useful tool to get a handle on. It's complex from the point of view that you need to have some sort of understanding of Hex. There is an area over here on the right-hand side where it converts what is on the drive from Hex into ASCII characters, but sometimes there's not an equivalent ASCII character and it'll print out gibberish. So it's not altogether as helpful as what it may seem, but certainly a good tool to get your head around. FAT, file allocation table. It's simple, it's low overhead. File structure that Microsoft originally designed for floppy disks. So for those of you under the age of about 25, you may not have even seen these things before. Basically, a floppy disk is just a hard plastic shell with a disk on the inside, which was made of a flexible polymer, which was magnetically encoded. And it used to fit into a drive. You could slide it in, you could read and write to it. If you're really interested, Google floppy disk and see what it is if you don't know what it is, but not really that important now. They're well and truly legacy. You won't see too many of them nowadays. So the FAT database is typically written to the disk's outermost tract. So that's the one on the furthest edge, on the most outside edge, and contains all the file names, the directory names, the date and timestamps, the starting cluster number of the file, each of the files, and the file attributes that are related to that file. Okay, so that's obviously a fantastic repository of information for your investigations. There are 3 current versions. Again, they are considered to be legacy. FAT16, which is a 16-bit version, FAT32, which is the 32-bit version. So in that you can access disks larger than 2 gig. Can be used with the newer Windows operating systems if you would want to. And there's exFAT, which is used for mobile personal storage devices. And then there are 3 older versions, which we really won't talk about too much: FATX, Virtual FAT, and FAT12, which was a 12-bit version. To be honest, they're all pretty old. And you'll potentially come across them for sure, but probably not as much as some of the other file systems. When we examine a FAT disk, we need to, so the operating system will allocate disk space for the files based on cluster size, as we were talking about before. And as I said, that will result in drive slack, because there are spots where, as I said before in the example, if you've got 512K cluster sizes and you've got a 768K file, that's going to be written over 1.5 clusters. So you're going to have half a cluster hanging there. That can't be used for another file. Okay, so it means that that part of the disk drive is actually slack. It's just sitting there doing nothing. So if you've got a lot of files that don't fit neatly into your cluster size, you will have a lot of slack space. So an unintentional side effect of FAT16 allowing the large clusters was that it reduced fragmentation of your hard drive. So what that basically means is, where you have lots of slack space and you want to write files across the different, so you might have a lot of small files that take up 1.5 clusters. Then as we go along, we delete some of those small files. So we free up a couple of clusters here and there across the disk. Then when a large file comes across, it's got to be written across clusters in different areas of the disk, which then means that the file is fragmented. So there might be parts of it on the inside clusters of the disk. There might be some in the middle clusters, might be some on the outside edge clusters. So the file is moved all around. And what that means is, when you try to access that file, it slows down access, because the drive's got to look at the inner clusters first, then the middle clusters, then the outside clusters. Whereas if we have larger cluster sizes and we delete files, more room becomes available, and we can write larger files in nice consecutive clusters, therefore reducing the level of fragmentation and therefore speeding up access to those files later on down the track.
Got a question on file slack, actually, Matt, from a little while ago, from Elena.
Yeah.
Is it possible to use some tool to hide specific data in the file slack that exists? Like, can you? Like,
yeah, absolutely. Yep, there are tools available to do that. Yep, absolutely.
Wow.
Win Hex is one of them. You can use Win to do that. So you can use tools like Win Hex to actually write to slack space in clusters if you want to do that, because you can find the slack space, you can see where there's allegedly nothing written or what's not active, and you can insert that information. So yes, you can hide it there, absolutely.
And why
that's a
would
challenge.
you?
Well, if you're trying to hide something, if you're
so it is hiding.
Yeah, it literally is trying to hide something. Yeah. Yep.
Mm.
So normally an operating system wouldn't do that, but you can use tools to actually do that with the purpose of hiding that information for whatever nefarious reasons you may have.
Oh, limitless numbers of things, yes.
Oh, of course, particularly for us.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so NTFS, which just stands for New Technology File System. So really, FAT was File Allocation Table, boring. NTFS, New Technology File System, even more of a snooze fest. Thank you, Microsoft. This was introduced in the early 1990s when Windows NT, which stood for Windows New Technology, whoop-de-doo, came out in the 1990s, and it is the primary file system currently used in Microsoft operating systems. It does have some improvements over FAT file systems in that it allows additional file information, which mainly facilitates security, quotering, compression, those sorts of things, okay, which FAT couldn't do, NTFS can do. It was Microsoft's strategic move towards creating a journaling file system. So that is, it would record transactions before the system actually carries it out. And then this allows you to reverse them at a later time. Okay, if you just write something without recording it, oh dear, so sad, too bad, can't do anything about it. But if you journal it first, so you say, this is what we're going to do to this file, these are the changes made, then I'll write it, then you can reverse it later on if you want to. So therefore, NTFS, the logging system, provides that ability to recover files if transactions that have been made are not right. So for whatever reason, whether it's been a mistake, something nefarious, or a faulty operation. Some other features of NTFS. In NTFS, everything written to the disk is considered a file, including directories. Okay, so they're just considered a file. Everything's a file. The first data set is the primary boot sector, so telling the partition boot sector, so giving us that information about where all the partitions start and end. And then there's a master file table after that. NTFS results in much less file slack space because of the way it's geometrically arranged. They're smaller for the clusters are smaller for smaller disk sizes. So the larger the disk, the larger the cluster, smaller disk size, the smaller the clusters are. NTFS also uses Unicode in its recording, which is good because it's an international data format. So it's a standardized based product, if you like. All right, that's a little bit of information on file systems, okay, just to whet your appetite. But what I'm more interested in is talking about these things that are a little left of center, a little different. Every forensic course you go to will talk about file systems, ho-hum. Not every forensic course is going to talk about some of these things that we're going to talk about here. And again, yes, it's only briefly, unfortunately, but we're trying to whet your appetite to spark your interest. All right, so virtual platforms. Quickly, some virtualization concepts, which many of you will probably already be aware of. Two types of hypervisors, what are called hypervisors. So there's a hardware-based virtualization, which is a type 1 hypervisor. And in this particular implementation of virtualization, we don't have a requirement for a host operating system. So these guest operating systems, so in this case, we've got our VMs. So an example of this would be ESX, VM ESX, where we don't really have an operating system underneath. We've got a hypervisor, which is virtual machine management console, if you like. We've got the hardware underneath that, which is the host. And then built on top of that, we have these individual virtual machines, which can run their own operating system and application software totally independent of each other. Okay, so that's a type 1 hypervisor. The key requirement is that the key difference is there is no requirement for a host operating system. So there is no ability to investigate the underlying host operating system because it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean you can't still look at the hypervisor for information. You absolutely can, but there's no operating system underpinning the whole virtualization process. The virtual machines, of course, have a standardized operating system, application software, and that can be investigated using our normal processes and procedures and tools. In a type 2 hypervisor or operating system-based virtualization, in this case, we do have a host operating system. So you can see the main difference is here we have a additional layer, whereas in type 1 we had virtual machine management, so like an ESX, and we had our hardware underneath here. In this case, we've got our operating system underneath that. So usually, more often than not, some type of Linux or Windows-based operating system underneath, which then underpins the virtual machine management, which is basically installed as an application, if you like, over the top of the operating system or on the operating system. And then you've got your virtual machines which exist in that. So an example of that would be something like VirtualBox or VMware VM Player, where you can download the software or VirtualBox, and the other one too, I was thinking a common one. Anyway, VirtualBox and VMware Player that you can download on your laptop if you wanted to. I certainly do. Run them up as a bit of software, and then you run your virtual machines within that software. Whereas type 1, you don't do that. You don't have an operating system. You have like an ESX server set up on your server, and you run your virtual machines from that. You manage it remotely using remote management tools. So quite a different architecture. The interesting thing about that is, of course, that the underlying operating system takes up resources, which in a type 1 hypervisor situation isn't quite as onerous as what it is in a type 2. So the software that runs virtual machines is called the hypervisor. So it could be like Microsoft have a hypervisor platform as well. VMware have their ESX server. There's a number of different systems around. As we said, two types of hypervisors. Type 1 don't need an operating system, usually installed on servers and workstations where they've got lots of RAM and storage, so we can run lots of different virtual machines in there. They're called things like VMware vSphere, or ESX as we're talking about. IBM Power V is also another example. Gone through there. Type 2 hypervisors where we require an OS might be most likely, and these are the ones that you're probably most likely going to find on suspect machines or on criminal machines, potentially depending on the type of investigation you're doing. Obviously, if it's a big corporate crime, then it may well be on a type 1 hypervisor. Otherwise, you're probably going to be looking at a type 2 hypervisor, in which case they're going to have some sort of software installed like VMware Workstation or VirtualBox, and they will have virtual machines running on that. To do an investigation on a VM, we need to acquire a forensic image of the host computer and obtain network logs or logs of network activity. And this is giving you the ability to link the virtual machine's IP address to log files to determine what websites the virtual machine may have accessed or what other assets the virtual machine may have accessed. To detect whether a virtual machine is on a host computer, you can look in the user or documents folders in Windows. You can check the registry for clues to see whether VMs have been installed or not. And you can look for the existence of a virtual network adapter. So if you've got any of those, then chances are at some stage, or there either is a virtual machine installed on it, or there has been a virtual machine. Often you will find that the registry or the user and document folders are your best bet to look at, because if someone's uninstalled, it may be that the virtual network adapter is gone, but there will generally be clues in the other two spots to tell that some sort of virtual machine has been installed. You need to determine whether USB drives or any external peripherals have been attached to the host. There could be live VMs running on those. Okay, so it may not be that they've got it on the physical device you've got, it may be on an external storage device that's been taken. VMs can also be nested inside other VMs on a host machine or USB. So you can have a VM platform running within a VM. So let's say you have VirtualBox running on your Windows machine. Within that VirtualBox, you might create another Windows server which you're running VirtualBox on and something else in that. That is possible. From a performance perspective, I'm thinking that would be pretty abysmal to take it down nested levels. But if you're trying to hide something, then it might be something that you would consider. For the purpose of virtualization investigations, you need to follow a consistent procedure as you would for any other type of device. So we image the host machine, computer, virtual device, whatever, using something like an FTK imager. Might not be that, but it might be. You locate the virtualization software and the VMs using information from the registry, looking for VM-related file extensions, so .vmx, and looking for those virtual network adapters, and looking for information within the users and documents folders to see whether there's anything there. You can export them from the host machine, so copy them, or you can actually export them using the management tools, or you could just copy them, obviously making it a bitwise copy. We do a hashing to make sure that we've got the integrity of the file is maintained. And then we open the image files in forensic software, or we create a forensic image and then mount it as a virtual machine on our forensic workstation. So you basically, if you know it's a VirtualBox or a VM workstation file, then you can open it using that software on your forensic workstation as well. It's interesting that with VM investigations, live acquisitions are often necessary to make sure that we include all the snapshots that they take to make sure that they're keeping up to date. particularly in environments where you've got hot swapping of virtual machines available for disaster recovery or redundancy. Static acquisitions may not include the snapshots, live acquisitions will. So that's another trick with VMs that you need to be mindful of. And then you've got to take into account all the other complexities we were talking about last week in terms of remote access and are they in the cloud, how do you get to them, and so on and so forth. You can also use VMs as forensic tools though. As I was saying before, you could have a copy of VM Workstation or Oracle Box, or you could have an ESX server that you actually upload these virtual machine images that you're taking as evidence to actually use them and investigate on them. Nothing wrong with that. When we perform our live acquisitions, they're especially useful when you're dealing with active network intrusions or attacks. So if you know an attack or an intrusion or a theft or something is currently in process, and a live acquisition is obviously the way to go, because you're going to get the best, you're going to get the red hot evidence there. But having said that, live acquisitions done even before you take a system offline are also invaluable, because attacks can leave footprints in the running processes or memory that once you obviously switch a system off, then you're not going to have access to that. So when we say take them offline, that's physically disconnect them from networks, but we're not turning them off, so that it's still possible to do a live acquisition based on the running processes or RAM. Important to understand the concept of order of volatility too. So that is what areas of data storage that you could be potentially investigating are more volatile than others. So RAM, for example, is more volatile than a hard drive. Registers and buffers, CPU registers and buffers are more volatile than memory. Okay, so those sorts of things, that order of volatility will determine what areas of digital storage you will look at first. You look at the most volatile first, because they're the ones that are potentially going to disappear the quickest. We have a number of steps for performing a live acquisition. We create or download a bootable forensic CD or USB drive. Again, these are very similar to what we've already talked about. Make sure you keep a log of all your actions for that chain of custody, rules of best evidence. A network drive might be ideal as a place you can send information you collect if you haven't got access to something physical with you, although I would always tend to stick with that if I could. Copy the volatile stuff first. So example, physical memory. Look elsewhere on the device depending on the evidence that you think you might need. And then always make sure that you do your hashing values regardless of the file size or file type or whatever it is, because then you know that you've got it at its purest. All right, so that's VM forensics. Okay, so just a little bit to whet your appetite on, a little bit about different types of hypervisors and the process we go through. And you can see that the process is going to be fairly similar regardless of what you're looking at. Network forensics, again, similar. Okay, network forensics is very dynamic. Okay, yes, we log a lot of traffic and activity going through network devices, but if it's something that's specifically attacking a network device, maybe not so much. Okay, but these are devices that are involved in the transit of traffic, the movement of traffic through your network. So again, they're fairly dynamic, important to make sure that logging is enabled, and if it's not enabled, when you connect to a device, enable logging so that it will at least show output as you're typing it down. It will show the reaction to your commands. So network forensics is really about monitoring, collecting, and analyzing the network activities, network data, and tracking network traffic as it passes over the investigative network. In most cases, we're using this to ascertain how an attack was carried out or how an event occurred on network. So it's more of a reactive, I guess, rather than a proactive type thing. Although there are components of security where it is proactive, in a forensic sense, it's more of a reactive thing. What we're looking for is really trails or fragments of information left behind by an intruder. Even the most skilled intruders or criminals will leave some sort of footprint behind, and we can often see that in our network logs and our network traffic. Network forensics can also help you determine whether a network is really under attack or whether there's something else going on. So it's just a performance issue or some other system failure. Network forensics, in terms of procedures, can be very long, very tedious, very time consuming. A standardized procedure is often used, and it's often best to use a standardized procedure. So we use standard installation images for systems on a network. Now, for things like routers and switches and that sort of thing, you will have a standardized image that you will use. For firewalls and IDS, you'll have a starting platform that you will use. Okay, so there will be a standardized operating environment, if you like, which you'll then build your security mechanisms, so your rule bases, your heuristics on top of that. We fix vulnerabilities after an attack, during an attack, hopefully before an attack, but if not, at least during an attack, so we can stop things down. We attempt to retrieve as much volatile data as we can, so again, live acquisitions. We try to acquire from all compromised devices. I would say more than drives, because they're not just drives. There's a lot of devices, a lot of storage areas in these sort of devices. And we compare files on the forensic image to the original installation image. Okay, so again, that comes down to hashing, verifying whatever you can. Sometimes you can't verify things. If it's a live traffic stream, you can't necessarily verify it. But what you've got is an exact, there's nothing to generate a hash on and then come back from. So it can be problematic in a network forensic environment. In digital forensics, you can work from the image to find most of the deleted or hidden files and partitions or evidence that you're trying to find. In a network forensics, sometimes we have to restore drives to actually understand the attack. So what we're trying to do with network forensics is understand the attack vectors. So how did an attack occur? How did they get in, rather than what did they steal? That's a digital forensic issue. Network forensic issue is really about establishing the modus operandi. As I said, very brief on network forensics. We could literally spend hours and hours on that, but again, it's probably going to be a smaller part of your network forensic journey. Most of the time, we're going to be looking specifically at digital type forensics, as I was just talking about. All right, last section, email and social media. So top 10 email clients market share by month. So what's the point of this? The point of this particular diagram is really to point out this little bit here, that 36.66% of emails were opened on iPhones, followed by 25% of emails opened on Google's Gmail, okay, across this time span. So December 2018 to December 2019. So each of these columns represents a month in between. So what we're saying is the two big guys are, in particular, Apple iPhone and Gmail. So what does that mean from a forensic point of view? It means that we're looking at a mobile device, one, so that's a different file system, different storage system, different way of looking at things, different set of forensic tools and skills. Or we're looking at Gmail, which is a cloud-based service. So virtualization, but not virtualization where we can control. We haven't got access to the data. We have to chase it up. We don't know where it's going to be located in the world. We don't know how we're going to access it, if we can access it. Okay, complexities. So that's really the point of this diagram, is simply to show that the percentage of emails being opened on mobile devices and Google and cloud-based devices is going to be growing. And if we look at what these names are down here, even, they're the two big babies, iPhones and Google Gmail, but there's also Apple Mail, Outlook. Okay, so Outlook, is that Office 365, in which case it's a cloud-based service, or is it local Outlook? Yahoo Mail, cloud-based service. Apple iPad, mobile device. Samsung Mail, mobile device. Outlook.com, cloud. Google Android. Okay, you get the idea. Cloud-based services and mobile services are the predominant location that people read their email now.
Is there not like a Chinese equivalent, like a WeChat or a?
Oh, there is, but it's just not. I'm just going through what's included on this. So there are. Yes, you're right. There are.
No, that's
and the
amazing that
question to
they're not even in the
ask,
top 10, right? Like,
yeah, but the question to ask is why are they not in the top 10? So is it maybe that information's not available? So
Ah,
we just don't know. We don't have visibility of it, which would
okay.
be, I mean, I'm not talking with any particular authority. I'm not trying to cast aspersions anywhere. I'm just saying I would think that's probably the likely reason why you're not seeing those sorts of stats in here.
Yeah, super
That's it.
interesting.
But yeah, a provocative point you raised, my friend.
Yeah, and also I'm very disappointed that the outlook is so low, and I wonder if we could like separate that out even further into Hotmail accounts because that's the one I'm still rocking, and I feel very lonely. But yeah.
Well, it probably is there somewhere. They've just chosen not to actually show it on this particular thing.
Not top
Um,
10.
no, not so. It might be 11. You never know. All right. So intro into email forensics. So what are we looking at in terms of the forensic investigations? What possible things could we look at? So we're looking at things like phishing and farming and spoofing, scam techniques, okay, where people are trying to get information from you or trying to get you to send them money, the classic Nigerian print scams and money scams, all those sorts of things, or they're trying to sell you a product which doesn't really exist, or they're trying to get some sort of information to steal your identity or gain access to some other organization. So they're using it as targeting. So in both internet and intranet email environments, email messages are distributed generally from a central server to clients that connect to it, right? And if you're sending email to remote companies, you'll send your email to your email server, and then that email server will send it to any number of intermediate email servers because they work like a routed network email serving, right? So we send our email to any number of intermediate email servers, and then it'll eventually get to the destination. Now, the interesting thing about that is that on each of those systems that it transits, there is a possibility that that email conversation can be intercepted, altered, changed, snooped on, stolen, whatever, deleted, forwarded to someone else. It's possible. Okay, it's possible. The thing we have to remember about email, and not a lot of people understand now, is that email is not a guaranteed service. It's not a guaranteed protocol. It's not guaranteed to get from one end to the other. And there are so many intermediate potential hops along the way that at any of those hops, it might be altered in some way. So confidentiality, integrity, or availability may be altered. But other than that, other than those complexities, the email investigations are similar to our other kinds of investigations. So we follow the bouncing ball. If we talk about forensic linguistics, this is a field where the language and the law meet. And this is to try to determine the author of the emails or the text messages or other online communications. And this is important because all of these systems can send messages or information over the entire planet. Between countries, across jurisdiction, legal and ethical jurisdictions, it can be a real minefield to look at. We can potentially access a victim's computer to recover evidence, maybe, but where do the emails exist? We've just seen that the vast majority of the top 10 over that particular period, and it's only getting worse or more, if you like, are in either remote devices, so handheld devices, or in cloud environments. And that then makes things really, really tricky. Here's an example of a spam email that I actually got the other day. And it looks, looks okay. And I think you probably got this one too, maybe Guy and Hannah, I'm not sure. But this is an email that purports to come from APD payroll, whoever they are. And there's some notifications here, and you can visit their website allegedly. And when you click on that link, this one is actually a deliberate one that's sent out so that when you click on it, it says, "Ha, you've clicked on the spam link, you idiot! You need some spam awareness training." At least I think it was.
I didn't click, of course.
No, because I thought I don't know who these APD payroll people are. But I mean, it's a really simple one. And this is actually, I don't know whether, hopefully I won't offend anyone by saying this, but this is actually written in relatively good English, whereas a lot of spam emails, because many of them come from non-English speaking countries, and let's face it, there's a lot of vast proportion of the world don't speak English fluently, then sometimes the wording, you can look at an email and you go, oh, hang on a minute, I know that's a spam email because it's all in caps, or the grammar isn't quite right. If you're I suppose if you're a grammar Nazi like me, it's easy to spot, but you can see things like this, whereas this one actually, other than a bit of poor punctuation, isn't too bad. So it's almost believable. And that's where you've got to be really cognizant of looking at who it's from and whether it's related to anything you know within the normal confines of your business and your activities. But they can be very, very convincing. And very, very easy to fall for, although in this day and age, there's a lot known about them. There's a lot of press about these sorts of things, press in inverted commas. So, we really shouldn't be getting caught by them, but we certainly do. And this is to demonstrate how much there is. So global spam volume. So that is the percentage of total email between the years 2007 and 2019 that was spam.
Holy wow.
Okay, so interestingly, and this may be counterintuitive, I don't know, for many of you, but interestingly, there's a very large downward trend. I have my theories on why that may be, but I would like to open that up and say to you and challenge you guys to interpret this. And this is, it's part of the reason too why I put a lot of these graphs into my tutorials or lectures or MOOCs or whatever I'm doing, is because I like to get you to critically think about graphs. So if you look at this graph, it tells us that there's a downward trend over this time period in the global spam volume as a percentage. Okay, so we're saying back in 2007, 88.5% of the total email sent in that year was spam. And now that is absolutely staggering. 2008, it went up, and then gradually since then, we had a bit of a hiccup in 2016, and 2018, but it's been on that downward trend. So my challenge to you is to not just say, okay, well, we're going down, trend's going down, that's great, we don't have to worry about spam anymore. Think about why that's the case. Why is that the case? Why is there less spam now than what there used to be? Is it, for example, just because the world is getting more up to speed with spam and understanding that exists, and so they're ignoring it more, and so therefore attackers are turning to other avenues of getting the information that they seek? So as we know, attackers are a bit like water or electricity. It finds a path of least resistance. So if this then becomes a path of resistance, why bother using it? It's no longer a tool we can use as an attacker, so let's move on to something else. That's a very simplified theory potentially on why that might be, but have a think about it. Delve a bit deep. You can see the source there. Okay, the source link there. If it's not, you'll see it when you open up the PowerPoint anyway. But I can also put that up as an additional resource. I challenge you to go and have a look at that and have a think about why that might be the case.
Yeah,
okay, it's just an interesting
too, Matt.
Yeah, because we really want, as forensic investigators, as security people, as humans in general, no matter what our field of endeavor, we need to be inquisitive, and we need to develop the skills of critical thinking to not just accept what's put in front of us, but to think about what's in front of us. Does it fit with our view of the world, what we know about the world? What else could it mean? Is it likely to be true? Is it likely to be untrue? And come up with your own theories. Don't be a sheep and go along with everyone else. Have a think about it and see if you can come up with something constructive. So I'd be interested to hear some comments on that and see some interaction in the forums on that particular question. So there's some food for thought for you. All right. Further on email. Email is asynchronous communication. So sender and receiver connect to the internet when required. So it's not instantaneous. What that means, it's bidirectional, yeah, because I can send you an email, you can send me one, but it's asynchronous, one direction at a time, bit of delay in between the reply, most times. Phishing attempts are really emails which contain links to illegitimate web pages, and they attempt to get your personal information from whoever the target is, okay? Different types of phishing exist as well, depending on the value of the target you're looking at. So we have there's a thing called whaling, which is going for top level targets. So CEOs, CIOs, CFOs, those sorts of people, top level executives. If you have, if you've got them in the gun, if you get them sucked in, you can often get to lower levels of the organization and therefore get access to other information that you need. Something like farming is where we use DNS poisoning to take users to a fake site. So we poison DNS so that the user can't get to the original legitimate site, but they go to a fake site. And that's when we then start to steal their information from that fake site. And then, so it might be their login credentials, and then we redirect them back to the real site via IP address or something, and they don't even know that they've been to a fake site. And then we've got our spoofing, which we use to commit fraud, which is basically just creating an email message with a forward sender that looks like it's legitimate. So it looks like it's a real email, but it's not. It's just some rubbish. As forensic investigators, we can use the headers. So the Enhanced Extended Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, so SMTP, that's the server-to-server protocol that's used to transfer email. There is headers, so message headers. It'll tell us where a message has been routed, through which servers and domains it's gone, and we can look at that to determine whether an email is potentially legitimate or not, and we can certainly tell in a lot of cases whether it's illegitimate. We use the email program that created the message to find the email headers, and this just gives us, so in, for instance, Outlook, if you've got the actual Outlook client on your system or whatever client you're using, there is the option somewhere within that client to actually look at the email headers to see this information, and it's included in all emails, no matter where they come from. Although there is a tool you can create that'll send an email without headers, but that's a story for another time. The good thing about that is it provides you supporting evidence, and it allows you to track where the email came from, because there's intermediate steps that the email goes through are all recorded. If you want to investigate email abuse, you have to be familiar with the email servers and the client's operations. Okay, so you have to understand SMTP. You have to understand POP3, IMAP, okay, and IMAP. So those protocols are a client server, so downloading email from the server using your client, or SMTP, which transfers messages between servers. You need to be familiar and have a basic understanding of how those protocols operate, and the headers and how to interpret those particular headers. For many email investigations, you can actually rely on the email message files, headers, and server log files. So they will actually piece together an appropriate chain of evidence for you to use in investigation. Maybe not in sophisticated spamming attempts, but in, say, if someone's commissioned someone to do a murder, for example, using email, then absolutely in that sort of case, then you'll be able to build some concrete evidence using those headers. Australia has a Spam Act to regulate commercial email and other types of commercial electronic messages as well, just for interest. In terms of our email investigations, this is basically what we're looking at. We've got a server and a client sending email backwards and forwards. That's great. Some of the things you can consider are getting the information around IP addresses and routing tables, etc., from the routers and the servers. So the email server routing messages as well. So also from a network and a router perspective. So you can use our network forensics as well as our email forensics to help build a coherent story about where the emails come and go. We could consider reviewing cookies, particularly if you're using some sort of web-based email system as well. We can look at Windows registries, and we can look at the actual data files that are related to our mailboxes, particularly if we've got our client locally. If it's a cloud-based system, not quite so easy to do that. In terms of the email messages themselves, if you can access a victim's computer or mobile device to recover the evidence, then that's ideal. We can use the email client to find and copy any potential evidence. to access protected or encrypted material or to print the emails. We can do that from the local device itself. If we're trying to do that remotely or trying to do that via some sort of sniffing or monitoring tool, particularly if it's encrypted, that's not going to be possible. So we get more information if we've actually got access to the local resource or system there ourselves. We can also guide the victim or whoever on the phone, the investigator might be another forensic investigator, about how to open and copy the email, including the headers, so we get all that information as well. And we may also have to recover deleted emails as a consideration to try and see what's in those as well, to build a chain of evidence. Email headers, so we need to learn how to do that, either GUI or web-based clients. There are ways to do that in all email programs. Once you've done that, you need to copy and paste them into some sort of text document, so then you can search through them with the text editor or a search capability. Number of different email programs obviously out there, lots of different email clients. It's your job to become familiar with them and understand how you view these headers and get this information off each of the different clients. Most of them are similar. They will have similar ways of doing it, but it's going to vary depending on the client and the operating system that you're involved in. But the headers will contain loads of useful information, particularly around the originating email's IP address, so the server it came from, or potentially the end client that it came from as well, the date and time it was sent, and the time zone. Obviously then will give you some sort of location. The IP address will give you some sort of geographical location as well, because of the way IP addresses are allocated across the globe. Obviously, if there's any attachments or any file names associated with it, you will see that, and the unique message number if it's actually supplied, depending on the server. You'll also get that unique message number as well, which will give you some information to go on. Here's an example of an email header as well. So just some basics of it before we sort of move on. I don't want to dwell too much on it, but we can see that it's received from this particular device. So it's an outlook.com address. Okay, so it's a Aussie Outlook.com server. That's an IPv6 address. It's okay, so it's probably come from Sydney. It's been picked up in Melbourne. It's been sent via HTTPS. That's all good. Date's important. Wednesday, 17th of March 2021 at 2:11:40. Excellent. Authentication results. Okay. So there's the domain. Okay, latrobe.edu.au. That's interesting. Okay. We've got some other information about the ciphers that it may have potentially used, where it's come from. We've got our IP6 addresses, but notice no IPv4 addresses there. We've got some MAPI IDs. Okay, so you've got some dates there. We've got the application, so it's got winmail.dat, so that tells you that it's sent by a local application rather than a cloud-based service. We've got our couple of addresses there, and we've got our subject and our threat.
Competitors, Matt.
Well, they are, which is interesting as well. And see, that's you never know. We're spying on our competitors.
I should hope so.
Absolutely.
The chat's gone nuts, Matt.
Oh, has it?
Oh, they love the email talk. It's
really?
Amazing. Yeah.
Excellent.
People sending links and interesting stuff all over the place. If it's something that you're keen on, folks, we have a short course. I chucked that in the chat a while ago. I'll see if I can just chuck it back in. We actually have a short course on phishing countermeasures. It's a pretty like entry level but really hands-on short course. It's a bit of fun to look around with. That's in the chat there. But yeah, people love it, Matt. Super
good.
And so many theories on your
good. I'm glad I've generated some critical thinking and some discussion.
Yes. So can't wait to see the forum.
No, absolutely. That'll be really good to look at that, because that's where we learn from these discussions and this critical thinking. So well done, everyone. Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it. All right, and we seem to be growing our audience slightly, so it's good. Our numbers aren't dropping over the course of the tutorial, which is good. All right, so that's a bit of a taster on email forensics. So you can see there's potentially a whole lot of that. There's a whole lot involved in that, a lot of interesting sort of cases you could get involved in with email. And remember that email and what we're talking about now, social media stuff, is not just, for the perpetuation of what we would call true digital crimes. So that is crimes explicitly around digital resources or digital assets. We can also facilitate all sorts of other normal crimes, if you like, or typical crimes like murders and kidnapping and, you know, all those sorts of things using these tools. And this is sort of where email, social media, mobile devices, that's where, you know, that component of it really comes into the fore, and where you really add that value as a digital forensic investigator. So you may not always be looking at true digital crimes. You may be looking at digital devices perpetuating physical crimes or other types of crimes. So it's a really interesting way to look at it. But anyway, on. Social media forensics. So we know that OSNs, or online social networks, are used to pretty much do anything. Okay, everyone, even oldies like me, are on social networking. Maybe not all of them, but you know, some of them. And there is literally dozens, if not hundreds, of different social media platforms that you can get on. We use them to conduct business. We use them to brag about, well, criminal activities we're talking about here, but you know, brag about the achievements of our children or ourselves or other people that we know. We use them to raise money for worthy and sometimes not so worthy causes. We use them for classroom discussions. Okay, so I'm sure there's, you know, a number of you that have used the different social platforms to either make discussion about this particular course or other courses. So we use them to network with people in that social sense, yes, but they're used for so much more than just social discussions now. Law enforcement companies and criminals can use social networks to find out about individuals. So I would hazard a guess that there's not one of us out there, not one of you out there listening at the moment, who hasn't at some stage searched up via some sort of social media platform about someone you knew or someone you heard their name about and you wanted to find out a bit more about them. It's what happens. In this case, criminals don't even need to crack passwords. They can use an individual profile to reset passwords for social media or email accounts. So it's actually not all that difficult to hijack someone's social media account. And it happens all the time. How many times do we hear celebrities say, "Oh no, sorry about that last post, my social got hacked." Whether or not that's actually happened, sometimes I severely doubt it, but it's quite easy to do. Social media, of course, can facilitate a number of nasty things. So things like cyberbullying, witness tampering, common, may be used to threaten or to find out more about a company's position on a particular issue. Can be intellectual property. Okay, intellectual property is a really important one that can be violated quite easily using these social media networks. You can also use them to find out who posted information and when. Okay, all pretty straightforward, unless of course something's been hacked or they've taken over someone's digital profile. Okay, so there's a lot of information that's available there to find. Some of it can be murky, and it's our job as forensic investigators to try and sort the wheat from the chaff, the true from the false. Social media can be used to substantiate claims, maybe, if it's legitimate, if it hasn't been hacked. Okay, and they can, the other thing to really be cognizant on is, of course, they involve multiple jurisdictions. Might even, no, I wouldn't say might even, do include international boundaries. Okay, a lot of the time, you know, you might have a conversation with someone that you've just met over, say, Facebook, for example. You might have a messenger conversation with them. There's no guarantee that you know where they are. They could be anywhere. They could be purporting to be anyone from any place. So these things from a forensic investigation perspective are important, because jurisdiction, where people are in the world, and what laws affect what they're doing and control what they're doing, can be real, or control what you can see as a forensic investigator, can be really, really important. On mobile devices, of course, this is where we're going to use them more often than not. Most people, well, I'm only guessing, and this is only anecdotal, I guess, from what I see every day, but most people don't use their laptop or their computer to get on their socials. They'll use their phone or their iPad or other tablet. And so that then adds another level of complexity on top of that, because then the file structure and the operating systems and the tools are all different for mobile devices to what they are to your normal laptop and desktop devices. Yes, there are some similarities. Yes, we follow the same process, but the tools are a little bit different. I'm not sure there's anything else I want to add to that really on top of what I've already said there.
Except that it's bloody annoying you can't use your laptop or desktop for all of the things that have mobile apps designed for them.
Yeah, yeah.
The
So yes,
the social netball thing, they try and make me download an app for, keeping track of the team. Don't have a smartphone. What am I going to do? Bloody delegate it to Hannah.
oh,
It's
well, good,
disgraceful.
you can delegate it at least.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone, come
Here,
on,
Hannah,
come on,
have some
guy.
more. Have some more unpaid labour. Jesus hell!
Oh God,
Unbelievable, man.
complain.
I know, just a
I
grizzle
mean,
guts, isn't he?
I mean, I don't know. All these sporting teams now use WhatsApp.
Yeah, but
That's what you
I
need to
can't
get
even
onto.
do that on the desktop. It's bloody because you got to set it up on the mobile phone, and they don't let you.
Oh, I know. It's hard work, isn't it? Good thing you're not part of an elite sporting squad, mate, because they all use WhatsApp as well. It's just the way to go.
All I'm asking, Matt, is will you be my mummy? For just if anyone out there struggle street. I digress, as usual.
As usual, but that's okay. It adds a bit of levity to a otherwise heavy topic. All right. So the forensic tools, what do we use? Software for social media forensics is being developed. Okay. Yes, there are tools that you can use. But if you think of them like not necessarily like you talk about desktop forensics and you talk about things like NCase and FTK Imager and those sorts of things. There are things, there's a thing called MSAB, which has been developed, although that's more around mobile, specifically mobile devices, but forensics around social media apps and systems are relatively new, okay? But they are being developed and they need to be developed quickly because, as soon as something new technology comes out, criminals work out how can we leverage it. Okay, we can't be caught. It's going to be difficult to investigate. Bang, off they go. So it's really important that we keep on top of this as an industry. So there are lots of tools being developed. What you find out there is, we'll talk a little bit more next week because we're looking at the tools more specifically next week. But there is stuff out there, not a lot at the moment. There are also questions about how the information these tools gathered can actually be used in court or in arbitration. And that's a really important point. Okay, we've got to be able to gather evidence and information in a legal way. Okay, chain of custody, rules of best evidence. I know we keep harping about that in digital forensics, but it's really, really important. And a lot of that is still up in the air around these social media investigations. We might also have to get the permission of the people whose information is being examined, maybe. Depends on the context. And I dare say would depend on the country you're in as well. Because I can think of some countries in the world that they probably don't care about that. They'll just, grab the information as needed. Well, there you go. We haven't done too bad, 20 minutes over the time limit. So that's a little bit of a taster of all those different areas, those slightly different off-center areas of digital forensic investigation that you will see in our 513 course very shortly. 597, you'll obviously see parts of it as these slides were adapted from that particular subject. Some other courses that you may find around, we'll talk about it a little bit more. And it's going to become more important as time progresses, particularly around social networking type platforms as well. That's going to become a big ticket item and around mobile forensics as well. So I hope you enjoyed that. Let's go through some questions, please, Guy.
Beauty, we've got about 17. Chuck them in, folks. We'll just go through them. Really interesting comment in the chat from Gerard. Cambodia uses Telegram more than WhatsApp. I hope that's the tangible Telegram. That would be really cool. I suspect not. And there's a heap of horror stories in the chat about the
I'm
use of
sure there is.
social media stories. It's actually terrifying. So I'm going to close the
Yeah.
chat for a sec. Alrighty, so let's go for some social media questions first. Actually, we've gone. Let's go straight to email questions actually, because there's a couple there. Are there tools available to assist in analyzing email headers, especially if you have a few email headers to analyze?
Yeah, there are. Yep, and we'll look at some of those next week.
Great. Excellent.
But yes, there are tools that you can use that will help you to collate and to sift through and analyze, because I mean, obviously not everyone's going to be an expert on SMTP headers. It's certainly useful if you can become fluent in the main points, like how to decode the routing within an email header to show which servers or which intermediate steps it's gone through and where it's potentially, been originated from. But yeah, there is, and it's not actually as complex as what it first looks at when you look at all the gobbledygook on the screen there, as we showed before. It is actually quite straightforward, and if you follow a methodical process, it's actually quite easy to get the information out of it that you need, because it's all IP addresses and domain names and those sorts of things. They're not scrambled or anything. They're written out there in the open. So from that point of view, it's quite straightforward. But yes, there are tools to assist with it.
Thank you. I'll get rid of this one from John M, who suggests that the downward trend in that graph that you showed on the slide deck about the proportion of emails that are spam, was wondering whether it's about spam detectors being used in platforms such as Gmail, so they're no longer as useful as before. Just food for thought. Chuck that in the
Good
forums,
comment,
folks.
good point. Yep, I like it.
Phil Perkins has sent a link about countries of origin of spam, which is really a cool idea. So go and have a look at that. I'll just answer that live, and you can see that in the questions that are answered.
Nice. Thanks.
Yeah,
Phil.
same mob that you had the link. You sent that link, or you got the graph data from. So that'll be good.
Indeed.
Matt, Jason sent a question in. In your experience, what would be the percentage across OS would you have conducted investigations? Or I assume overseas. When you conduct your investigations, are they mostly involving overseas jurisdictions?
No, most of the stuff I've done would have been local within Australia. Maybe on the odd occasion New Zealand, or England, but no, other than that, no. Or actually, there was one I can remember. A couple in South America, Brazil, in particular, Brazil. That was, cool. Yeah, actually, that was quite a large one, and sometimes the States. Interestingly enough, even though they get a lot of bad mail, I've never actually been involved in one with China or Russia, and yet both of them get a lot of bad mail.
That is interesting. Maybe questions of who they target and why.
Well, I think so. I think it's more a function of probably who I worked for at the time. That they weren't likely to be targeted by Chinese or Russian hackers.
Yeah, damn. Did you get any trips
and again,
out of
it? That's why too that most of the stuff I've been involved in was from a local perspective, because it was more likely to be hit by local hackers or local criminals.
Yeah, right.
And that's just a function of who I worked for at the time.
Yeah, cool. Did you get any cool trips out of it when you did have the Brazilian and US ones?
No.
Oh, no. Bugger. I'm sorry. No. I'm sorry.
Budget didn't extend quite that far.
Disgraceful. Wade asks whether the final exam will include all the content and homework provided to us. Yes, but I'll talk much more about that next week. You'll be very happy to hear, Wade. Alrighty. Okay, Akash is asking a question about what file system Apple has for their ecosystem.
Well, they actually now, it depends on how old you're talking, but they basically use Linux variant underneath now. So they're a Unix system, so a Unix file system.
Okay. And there was a question earlier. I'll just try and find it. Oh, dearie me. Nope.
Oh, Hurley.
Lost my train of thought. But anyway, I'm back up the top, so I might as well ask a couple of questions here, just get them out of the way. An anonymous attendee asked whether in digital forensics, is it hard to rebuild
Oh,
the
no, I'm
hard
just
disk
reading
drives?
that one.
Yeah, have been dismantled.
Yeah, so
And is just
wow.
smashing them enough?
Yeah, in the most part, yes. If you actually go to the effort of dismantling a hard drive, pulling it to bits, depending on what else happens to the platters, it may be possible to still get some information off that platter. But I mean, you've got to then put it all back together again. And, it's not, a physical platter off a hard drive is not something that you can just put into another drive and have, there's complexities around that which are blowing my mind at the moment. So that would make it very extremely difficult. However, I have heard of, not directly involved, but I know of cases where hard drives have been, for instance, thrown into a lake or buried or burned, and because they haven't been 100% totally destroyed, like the circuitry in the example, the burned one, the circuit boards and all that had burned off and it melted and twisted away, but the actual fire hadn't got hot enough to do any main damage to the platters on the inside. And so there was some data able to be recovered from that. But in terms of the one that was thrown into the ones I know of that have been, and there's quite a few of them I've heard of, one's been thrown into fish tanks and swimming pools and God knows what else. And if those are retrieved and are thoroughly dried out without power being applied to them, then generally they come back pretty well. So it is possible in those sort of circumstances. But if you would actually rip a hard drive to bits into its different components and strew them all over the place, that would be pretty difficult to. I'd never say impossible, but it would be pretty hard.
You heard it here first, folks. From IT Masters, mind you, the trick is to electrocute the goldfish.
Indeed. Yeah, they'll do it.
Oh, wow. Heavens above. Cool stories. In doing digital forensics, do we need an accredited forensic laboratory?
Depends on what sort of forensic examinations you're doing. So if you're doing anything from a legal perspective, it's better to have some sort of accredited laboratory and environment, absolutely. If you're a forensic investigator within a corporate organisation, then that may not be necessary. So it depends on context.
Mm-hmm. Hannah, let's give people about a minute to ask more questions, but then we'll stop taking questions. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. Thank you, Lucas, for sending that one in. Peter's asked what we can do with fragments of files, and I'm very intrigued by this, given the question about hard disk drives as well. Peter knows that fragments of an SQL or TXT or XML or other text-based files can be read normally, but photo can contain types of data and preview JPEGs if you have the first sectors. But what about some other file formats and fragments from the middle of some binary file?
Yeah, it's a good that's a good question. You certainly may not be able to view it with the native viewer. Absolutely not. It might just open as absolute rubbish. Like for example, a PDF file. If you've only got the end fragment of a PDF file, you're not going to be able to open that PDF file because the start of the PDF file actually indicates that it is an Adobe PDF file, and it signals how it's got to be read and how you open it. So it can be, in that case, you're not going to be able to look at it with a native viewer, but you can always, and when I say always, I probably shouldn't use a blanket term like that, a definitive term, but in the vast majority of cases, you will be able to open them with some sort of hex viewer or some type of forensic tool like an NCase or an FTK, which will allow you to at least get a look at the code the hex code or the binary code that's within that particular document, and you may be able to piece something together from that. It's not definitive. So the answer is you can usually open them in something, some type of tool. Whether you will find anything useful in them or not is debatable.
Thanks. Alvian asks whether raw data from an unpartitioned drive or unpartitioned empty areas can be read.
Yes, is a short answer. Yep. With specialized tools, yes, you can.
I guess that's like for many of the questions that we like maybe answers or like just yes, but with specialized tools. So
yeah.
Andre asks, you mentioned FAT and NTFS. How about the newer Microsoft REFS or refs? I'm not sure how it's said. What tools are there to recover files with this new system?
Pretty much the same sort of tools, exactly the same sort of tools, just dependent on whether the support for refs has been written into or covered with particular tool that you might be looking at. But you know, there's some of the individual standalone tools that you might look at might struggle with it. But in general, it's not an issue for the bigger corporate enterprise type, if you like, or if you want to call them that, type tools like NCase, FTK, those sorts of things. I don't have any problem with that at all.
Judy, thanks, Andre, for sending that in. Elena, another question. When a hard drive you are taking a forensic copy of contains virtual machines, do you treat them as separate machines and create copies of them too for the purposes of your investigation?
It's not a bad idea to do that. The primary thing is that you would take a forensic copy of the hard drive in its entirety, multiple copies, as we've spoken about before. And then once you've done that, it would make sense to then treat each of the virtual machines as a separate entity.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Elena. More questions on virtual machines, and we've actually got a short course on virtual machines as well specifically. It's a masterclass, so it's like heavy going content, and if you're a bit of a noob like me, it's just going to go largely over your head. They were 2-hour like just stream of consciousness, amazing lectures that were pretty cool. So go and have a look at that if you can. But Adnan asks, could you use a type 1 hypervisor as a substitute operating system and then run a type 2?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
So type 1, just to clarify, so type 1 is where we don't have any underlying operating system, right? So then in that, we could run a virtual machine that is an operating system, and then in that operating system, we could run a type 2 hypervisor. Yes.
Thank you. Terai asks, to get data from the RAM of a virtual machine, is it physical or virtual?
Well, ultimately, it's in the physical. Ultimately, it's in the physical memory of the machine that that VM is connected to. So if you power down, the only thing is with a VM, depending on how you power it off or suspend it, you may actually have a copy of its virtual memory in the VM file itself. But ultimately, it is all stored in the physical memory of its host.
Thank you. Bruce asks, when you boot into a live environment, the live environment would require memory and wouldn't know about the original operating system's memory allocation. Would this not potentially damage evidence?
Let me just digest that for a minute. When you boot into a live environment, the live environment would require memory and wouldn't know about the original operating system memory allocation. Would this not potentially damage evidence? I'm not, so live environment, by that I'm assuming you're talking virtual environment.
Hey, Bruce, if you're still around, maybe just refine
And
the question.
I think that's what it's pertaining to. So the virtual, if you log in the virtual environment, it doesn't know about the original operating system memory allocation underneath. Well, that's all handled by the hypervisor allocation. So while it doesn't know about the original operating system memory underneath, there is some system applied to the allocation of the memory, but it would not be beyond the realms of possibility that it could potentially damage evidence, remembering that particularly in a type 2 environment where you've got the underlying operating system, there might be something in the memory of the operating system that you want to keep, and once you've booted into that virtual environment, that segment of the memory has then been taken over by the virtual machine, and so it's possible that it might overwrite evidence in memory at that particular point. In a type 1 situation where you just have management underneath, I think that would be much less likely. But in type 2, yeah, it is a possibility, I guess.
Thank you. Vitor, no need to apologise for bringing a question related to last week's module. Have you ever run into a situation where someone challenged the validity of a data acquisition you've made using a software-based write blocker tool?
I think I'm going to let you down here, Vitor.
No one would ever challenge you, Matt, surely.
Oh, plenty of times. I've got children, remember. Not that I can recall. I would have to say that would be a no. I can't recall. And I must admit, I haven't used software-based write blockers all that extensively. I'm a hardware man, but
surely if you follow the protocols.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. If you follow all the right tools and which of course we always do. No, I can't think of a time. No, where someone there may have. I mean, and I guess what you're really asking, the question really is: are they questioning the process, or are they questioning the fact, it's a software tool rather than a hardware tool, which is more definitive and harder to bypass, and more likely to introduce errors and those sort of things. So, no, I haven't had anyone do that, but I could see where that argument might potentially come from. And obviously that you then need to be well prepared in terms of having an understanding and documentation and certification around the software-based write blocker that you're using to be able to back that up.
Thank you. Ahmad asks, what about evidence acquisition for cloud instance? Is it similar to VMs? How about containers?
Yeah, similar process for both. Yep, absolutely.
Beauty. Thank you, Ahmad. Phil, who sent in that lovely link, also sent in, since COVID, there have been more people working from home, and thus that we are more susceptible to receiving spam via their own networks. What would be the update of the graph to show since Jan 2020 of such spam exposure? That's a great question.
Well, it is a great question, but I challenge the validity of it in some ways. Yes, there have been more. Well, just hear me out. There are definitely more people working from home. Whether that has how that has affected the susceptibility or the likelihood of receiving spam is unclear. I don't know about the validity of that particular part of the statement. I can see where Phil's driving with it, and anecdotally you might say, okay, I could live with that. But the scientist in me says, I'm not quite sure about that. But it would be interesting to see. Now, I can't answer that quick because I don't know what the graph looks like since January 2020. But it's a very interesting thought. As I said, I'm not 100% sure that the question is necessarily valid, but I understand where you're going with it. And it would be interesting to look at. I might actually see if I can find some information on that, see whether there's got an update on that.
Sent you down a rabbit hole here.
No, it is. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure that the premise of it is necessarily valid from a ecological point of view. But anyway.
Yeah, Phil, for example, the computer I'm on right now at my home used to live at my workplace, and it uses all of the same garbage apart from the internet connection. So I don't know whether I would be more or less likely to receive it if with the existing protections in place.
And when you think people are working from home, you'd also have to ask the question: are they working from home using business provided devices? In which case, they're still accessing the same software that they always have, like you're just alluding to there, or are they using their own devices and VPNing in? And therefore, in which case they probably normally do that anyway. So they've already got their own personal email and their business email that they've always had anyway. So yeah, I see what Phil's driving at, but I'm not sure that actually changing the location in which you do your work would influence the likelihood of you either receiving spam, I'm pretty confident in saying that, or your susceptibility to Well, maybe the susceptibility of it, because if you're in your home environment, you're not in a work environment where you're worried about if I click on this, oh, gee,
I'm in pajamas.
yeah. I mean, we're going
And
down a
am
rabbit
I
hole
really
there.
even
That's a
working?
really, the more I think about it, the more interesting I think that question is, Phil.
Chuck it in the forum, please. This will be fun.
Yeah, that'll be an absolute ripping. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. That's a very provocative question you raised there, Philip.
That's right,
Nicely
Phil.
done.
Steve, on the other hand, asks, does use of VPNs and other software to hide IP address work? In other words, does this make it harder when performing network forensics?
Yes, but probably for not the reason that you may think based on that question. The main reason is because VPNs, by definition, are a virtual private network, and therefore they use some form of encryption. And wherever you have a version of encryption, some form of encryption, it makes network forensics infinitely more difficult, if not impossible. But that comes down to the actual the function of a VPN, because virtual private network, private means encryption over a public medium. So using internet, that's the whole point of it. So yes, it does make it harder when performing network forensics, absolutely. But nothing to do with hiding the IP address on that. It's simply because the payload is encrypted. You can't see what's in there.
So encryption itself would be a short course in and of itself.
Oh, that'd actually be a long course in and of itself.
Ooh, that's exciting.
The only other thing, and I'll just mention this because I know there'll be some network person out there like myself will be thinking this, or just being provocative. GRE tunneling is something that they use to provide the functionality of a VPN network, but doesn't do encryption. So if it's a GRE tunnel, so that's generic routing encapsulation. If it's using that, then it doesn't have any impact on your network forensics. But if it's a genuine VPN, which is encrypted, then it does. I just want to clarify that because I know someone out there will be asking that question.
Thank you. Pico has an 8-point question, perhaps.
Yeah, an 8-point plan. Yes, I've read through a bit of that, and it's good. Good thinking.
All right. Oh, here we go. This is about the graph.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh,
He's critically thinking. Beautifully done, Pico.
well done. I'm just going to answer that live and leave it for thems that are looking to pick it apart and be real critical and make Pico feel horrible. And I'm very sorry, Pico. We've answered Peter's question, I think. Yes.
Yes, we have. Yep.
We're back to Phil. Another one.
Phil again.
There is a large issue of foreign interference, no kidding, in data hacking via spam and spoofing. And this creates a real headache for government departments to tidy up their ICT network systems. Might it be worth adding this type of topic in amongst the courses? Yes.
Yeah, it might be.
And would this be covered in the full course?
I'm not. No, I don't think it is. Not in 597. No.
Join the signals directory.
But
this course will get you the job, and then you can do it.
But the interesting thing is, I'm in the process of redeveloping 513, and that might be something we could put in that, because that is another interesting point. Yeah. Get this Phil on the phone. I like his thinking.
Well, yeah, maybe we just.
Well done, Phil.
Would it be a standalone subject? Or would it? Yeah,
you can certainly mention it as part of forensic thing, but I mean that would sit into that would also probably you might actually find some of that will fit into the cyber warfare subject.
Oh yes, that's a good one.
Because that would certainly make sense in there.
Hey Hannah, can you grab the link to the cyber warfare and terrorism short course that we ran in 2017?
Because there might be a bit of that in there. I mean, yes. And the Americans are talking about that Russian trying to influence their previous elections.
That one talks more about the sociology of the cyber warfare and terrorism as much as the doings. Yeah, very interesting stuff there.
It is.
Thanks as ever, Phil. Good questions tonight. Another one from Imad. What about?
No, we've done that one.
We've done that. They're all back. What have I done? Have I just done the wrong thing? Anyway, Colin.
Yep, that's true. That's why disk drive shredders are used. Yep, that's right. Correct.
I didn't get forensic linguistics. Can you just brief about it from Akash?
So forensic linguistics, let's go back. Whoop, no, we won't go that way. Let's go to where we mentioned it. I can't remember where it was mentioned now. There it is. So linguistics is really just the intersection of language and the law. So what this basically means is it's a combination of looking through the email headers, trying to determine where the emails come from, where they've come from, the content of the email, the text messages, or any other online communication. And then I'm trying to think of the word I'm trying to think of. Then looking at it from a legal perspective in terms of what you can and can't use as evidence based on the jurisdiction you're getting that evidence from. So say, for example, I get an email from some guy in Brazil. We use Brazil example, why not? And it's some sort of extortion email, and and so I engage someone to investigate about it, and they go through the process of finding that it's come from Brazil, the IP address, and they track down through the ISP the name of the person, blah, blah, blah. It's then about having discussions in terms of the legal jurisdictions and the law and where it sits in terms of what can we use as evidence, what can't we use as evidence, what is relevant for an Australian court, or, if we take the case to Brazil, what's relevant in a Brazilian court, for example. So in that sort of example, if we were to find out who that person was in Brazil and it was a serious crime, we would then have to look at the law and say, well, is there any way that we can use that evidence that we've collected from the Brazil end of the investigation to mount any charges against that person, and are they going to stick in an Australian court, and can we extradite the person, and all those sorts of things. So that forensics linguistics is that field of determining that what evidence can be used legally in each of the jurisdictions, whether it's valid if it comes from a different legal jurisdiction, and how that all fits together to make it a legal case. In things like organisational investigations, it's not relevant, but it's relevant for obviously big international cases.
Thank you. Peter sent a very interesting story in. I run a data recovery lab, says Peter, and there are some academic concepts, but I know not one lab which can retrieve data if data is wiped or platters are physically damaged or scratched. Tiny scratches you can seal up, but that is all you can do. Fire and water is another story. Platters can be cleaned, and as long as there is a ROM chip, as long as a ROM chip is not damaged, a recovery is possible. On some drives, you can even do recovery without the ROM chip. Thanks heaps, Peter. That's a really interesting story.
Yep, correct.
I'll take that as a comment, as the old Tony Jones would have said. Two left. Let's go with Jason first. And this is the age-old depth versus breadth question, Matt. You mentioned you need to have a good level of knowledge across all operating systems. Do you have colleagues who specialize in one system or another? And is this preferred for in-depth investigations? Is it even likely that significant breaches will just be on one system?
Yeah, first part of the question, yeah, absolutely. Colleagues who specialise in Windows, in Linux, in Mac OS, absolutely. They do have a good general knowledge across all operating systems, and that's simply usually a product of where they've come from, their work experience in the past. But absolutely, most of us specialise in one specific operating system. The vast majority of my expertise is in the Windows environment, without a doubt, and then next would be around that Linux/Unix environment, and Mac OS I know very little about. I know a little bit about a thing called OS2, which I'm betting London will brick there's not too many people still out there that actually know what that is. That's a very old one. But yeah, certainly we all specialise in one another. In terms of in investigations, the vast majority of my experience has been around corporate investigations, and in those situations, it is more likely than not that an incident will be perpetuated against a single operating system. rather than across different systems. Although, oh, no, it wasn't in. I'm not sure it was in last week's session I was talking about it, or in my other subject that I'm currently running, where I actually spoke about a denial of service incident that happened when I first started at a bank. And there was multiple operating systems involved in that, but it wasn't really a forensic crime investigation. That was a forensic investigation to determine the direction and vectors of an attack. So that's slightly different, I guess. But yes, often it will be perpetuated against a single operating system.
Thank you very much. Colin has an OS2 Warp t-shirt, if that means
Very good. The old OS2 Warp, exactly. Still got a t-shirt. Wow, I'm impressed.
That's good t-shirt maintenance as much as anything else. And finally, anonymous attendee says, given the plethora of data recovery services available today, is the theory of overriding hard disk drives with zeros multiple times in order to wipe a drive ultimately a waste of time?
Not if you use the right algorithm. There's a number of algorithms that vary in levels of sophistication in terms of how you can wipe your drives, and there's a number of them that are military specification, and that's what they tell you about. And if you use those, yeah, there's really not much coming back from any of those. If you use a drive and wipe it with one of those sophisticated mil-spec type algorithms, you're pretty safe.
I'd be interested in knowing if everyone gets rid of their HDDs and just their own personal disposal systems. Chuck that in the forum. Why the hell not?
I would think most people just throw their drives out. They don't want them. I don't. I mean, and I will, depending on what's on a hard drive or what's been on a hard drive, I might just throw it in the bin, or I might dismantle it or smash it with a hammer or something. But otherwise, yeah, if there was something really important on it, I might wipe it. But yeah, otherwise not. Or if I was going to give it to someone else, or I was selling it to someone else to continue to use, then I would definitely wipe it. Absolutely.
Yeah, could just use as performance art. I think we put next to a computer at an old house party. Anyway, it's getting late. I'm talking rubbish. Hey, thanks everyone for hanging around, and thanks so much, Hannah, for curating the questions and chat and all of that stuff and making sure the course page is even a thing. Thank you, Matt, for populating that wonderful course page with your resources in such a coherent way. It's not unnoticed. And thanks everyone for hanging around and asking great questions and making Matt's wonderful presentations even better through your engagement with them. I'll leave it to you, Matt, to say good night.
All right. Well, thank you very much as ever, Guy, for your marvellous emceeing and management of the questions. Thank you, Hannah, as well, for staying around for as long as what you have, nearly 2 hours in assisting with that. And thank you, everyone, for hanging on as well as you have. So next week, last week of our short course, we'll look at digital forensic tools. So we'll, I haven't put the resources up for that just yet. They will be coming in the next couple of days, so keep a lookout for those. And that'll finish off our course. And then remembering there will be the exam, which will be available to you after the end of next week as well. 1 hour exam, 40 multiple choice questions based on all the content that we've covered and that we've provided you. So not just what we've spoken about on each of the tutorials, and that will be available to you next week as well. So I hope to see you all there back again on Monday evening next week. And then until then, stay safe and happy, and enjoy the rest of your week.